Hey everyone. I'm Sarah Beery, and I'm a third-year grad student here at Caltech, and I do computer vision with Dr. Pietro Perona. And most of my work is focused on doing automated species identification from different data streams. And so as a technologist who's really passionate about biodiversity, I'm very excited and honored to introduce Dave Thau. Dave is currently the Data and Technology Global Lead Scientist for the World Wildlife Fund, which is a very impressive title. And he's actually only been with WWF since September, but before that he was with Google, where he was very instrumental with the Google Earth engine, and he also worked on some amazing projects like Global Forest Watch or Map of Life and the World Resources Institute. And then he's also been involved with a bunch of different companies, such as the California Academy of Sciences, the Kansas University Museum of Natural History, and he's incredibly well published with papers in Nature and Science, and so we're just very excited that he's here. And actually, something as I was researching his sort of introduction, I learned that he actually has an aunt that was named for him. So he has the great honor of being the namesake of the Plectroctena thaui, which I think talk about like life goals, right? But yeah, so please everyone welcome David Thau.
Thanks, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming, braving the rain and the hail and the crazy weather. It's really great to be here. I had two big inspirations that got me involved in biodiversity, I think. One was I was born in New York, and I used to go to the American Museum of Natural History as frequently as possible. And then when I was 13, we moved to LA, where I went to the La Brea tar pits as often as possible. And the La Brea tar pits, one of the things that came out of that was a lot of work on the evolution of mammals by Chester Stock, who was one of the people who co-founded the Geology and Planetary Sciences department. So it's very grounding to be here. It's one of the things that got me here is the person who started this place, which is really nice. So I'm going to talk to you about biodiversity, what it is and why we care. I want to start with a caveat, which is that I'm not a conservation biologist or a biologist of any sort. My training is in computer science. My research was on data integration, and sort of on the boundary of databases and artificial intelligence. But for about 20 years, I've been using that on projects around biodiversity and ecosystem services and things like that. So during that time, I've learned a thing or two about biodiversity, and I will tell you about them, but they're going to come from this sort of engineering perspective. All right, ready? So I'm going to go through what biodiversity is, how we measure it, and why we care. All right, what is biodiversity? All right, so biodiversity as a term is new-ish. For a while, people were talking about biological diversity. So in like '68, that term started getting tossed around. And in '85, it got contracted by Laura Tangley in this report where she, it was a US strategy on the conservation of biological diversity. And then somewhere in here, she wanted to squeeze it in. So she said biodiversity. And that's, I think, the first time it appeared in print. But it really took off when E.O. Wilson, who, by the way, is well known for his work on ants, was asked to put on, by the National Academy of Sciences, to put on a conference about biological diversity and how we can help stave off the losses. And that happened in 1988. And he put together this compilation of the papers there, and he called it biodiversity. And that's when the word really sort of took off. So it's actually not that old of a term. It's like 30 years around. There have been lots of definitions of biodiversity kicked around. The sort of one that's, I think, the boss of them all is the one by the Convention on Biological Diversity, which you could think like biodiversity. It's, well, maybe it's just all the species on the planet. And That would be a very straightforward answer, but of course, nothing's straightforward in science. There are actually lots of different kinds of biodiversity. And so you can see in this definition that talks about, there's terrestrial, marine, aquatic ecosystems involved, and the diversity is within species. So that's actually genetic variation within species, between species, which is diversity of species within an environment, and also diversity of ecosystems. Right? So these are all the different kinds of biodiversity. I'm going to focus on this one between species. So the kinds of biodiversity where you're looking at plots of land and trying to figure out what kind of critters and plants live there. But I want to make sure that people realize that that's just a small part of the things you could possibly be talking about when you're talking about biodiversity. This tree here, the distances between the lines is a sort of distance and the RNA of the species. And this over here is people, that's corn, and that's a mushroom, right? So here's how close we all are. This is like the rest of the tree, right? So there's this whole area of metagenomics, which is like you look at the gut you look at your guts, and there you have a microbiome in your gut. You sample that, and there's all kinds of stuff going on in there that's different than like a tiger or a panda bear. The same if you sample from the ocean or you sample soil. There's all kinds of biodiversity in there that's critical to study for understanding how ecosystem services work and ecology works, or how we work when you look at our own inner biome. But I'm going to focus mostly on the stuff that goes on in here. And maybe that's because of my WWF focus on, largish things, which means like even little beetles. All right, so that's a little bit about what biodiversity is. I'm going to tell you about how it's measured, and it's measured in lots of different ways. There are a couple of basic fundamental terms that people throw around when talking about biodiversity. Let's talk about a community. And this community includes these species. So it's a capybara and what do they call that thing? A Sally Lightfoot crab, a proboscis monkey, and a panda. Oh yeah, so I work at WWF now. I have to have pandas as much as possible. There's I think as I'm there longer, I can have fewer and fewer, but since I just started, I gotta have a lot. So there's number one. Okay. Now you can talk about, let's say you have a community and it's got these 4 species. There's a straight measure, which is called species richness, and this is called alpha biodiversity, and it's just the number of species within that area. So here we've got our ecosystem number 1, and it has those 4 species, and we say the species richness is the alpha biodiversity is 4, okay? Now, the next kind of diversity, the next 2 are beta and gamma, and they come in when you want to compare different regions. So, let's say we got these 2, and in ecosystem number 2, we lose the panda and we get this jaguar. How do we compare the richness between these species? Well, there's 2 different measures, beta and gamma. Gamma is the summed diversity, so the number of species in the combined area. So in this case, there are 5 species. And beta is the difference between them. So you can see here, this one has A and B, and this one doesn't, so that's 2. This one has E, this one doesn't, that's 1. So you get a beta of 3, okay? So that's just some basic terminology for you. Now, sometimes these basic measures of richness won't tell you exactly what's going on. They're informative, but sometimes there's more information that you need. So let's take the same 4 species and look at different ways they could be distributed on a landscape. One is like this, so you're wandering around and you might see a crab and a capybara and then another crab and a panda, right? And this is pretty diverse, right? Or you could be walking around in an environment that looks like this, which is my idea of heaven. I like capybaras. Everybody's a capybara here. But it's not particularly diverse. It's the same 4 species, but in this one is clearly dominated. And if you look at alpha, alpha is the same for both of these. If you look at beta, beta diversity is 0, right? So there's something else going on. And to capture that, use a metric called species evenness. And here's the formula for one of the formulas for species evenness. It's E to some diversity measure divided by the number of species. And one of the favorite diversity measures is this one. So you've got I goes from 1 to the number of species, and you take the probability of encountering that species times the natural log of the probability. I like this because for the information theory people, that's Shannon diversity. This is a metric of information that's at the heart of a lot of computer science theory. So it's kind of lovely to see this basic formula that goes throughout computer science appear in this context. All right, so these examples I showed all are about, they kind of assume a lot of knowledge about what the species are and what their abundance is. But it's not often the case that you go to a place and you know all of the species that are there and how many of them there are there. That doesn't happen. So you have to come up with ways of dealing with doing these measurements in practice. And here's panda number. Oh, well, we had a lot of pandas before, so I don't know what this panda's number, like 14. Okay. So here are some indirect measures that people are using now to keep track of biodiversity on the planet. One is called the Living Planet Index. So the Living Planet Index is something, collaboration between WWF and the Zoological Society of London. And this is a measure of populations over time. So what this index does is it looks at a set of species. It's 4,000 species. And for each of the species, the number of populations, so it's 16,000 populations altogether, and it tracks the size of those populations over time. And it looks to see, for each population, is it increasing over time or is it decreasing over time? And then to get the overall Living Planet Index, it aggregates that and gives you a chart like this. So this is the chart from the 2018 report, which goes up to 2014 because it takes a while to get all the data together. And the number that comes out of this is a 60% decrease in populations from when the report started to now. So for the populations they're measuring, it's a 60% decrease, which is pretty big. And we'll talk more about those kinds of stories later on. The way those are divided up is sort of terrestrial species, a 38% decrease. Freshwater species in particular are getting hard hit. Amphibians are in a very sad state. And marine biodiversity in this measure of population has decreased 36%. So that's one biodiversity measurement that's popular. Another is this species habitat index. And this is a newish one. The way this works is you have a set of species you're concerned with, and you can use models based on where you observe them to predict their habitat, where they're likely to exist. And then what you can do is you can look to see how that habitat changes over time. Is that habitat being impacted by agriculture? Is the habitat opening up because of some political change in a country or something like that? And you can average over all the species you're interested in and over all the habitats that they have and measure their change over time. And that gives you these species habitat indices. So for instance, this bird had initially in 2002 had a suitable habitat of 8,000 square kilometers, and it dropped by some significant percent over the span of the study. This is being used by the IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. That's the agency that the UN relies on to provide data about biodiversity, and IPBES is a fan of the Species Habitat Index. Another one is the Biological Intactness Index. So what this thing does is it looks at the world and it breaks it into ecosystems, and then within those ecosystems it looks at specific populations, and then it has these graphs showing like the impact on populations based on the what's going on in the land that they're on. So this is protected area. The distributions are high. In urban areas, distributions typically are lower. And it looks over time at land use change. And it says, how is the land that these species are living on changing over time? And it comes up with an index by using these graphs. So this is an interesting one. Their finding in the recent, 2016 report was across almost 60% of the world's land surface, biodiversity has dropped below what they call, the planetary boundary. So the planetary boundary where people feel safe, like our biodiversity is intact, is about 10% decrease. So 60% of the world's land surface, it's dropped below a 10% or more than 10% decrease in biodiversity, according to this index. And the fourth way I'll talk about, the fourth kind of index is just straight up like extinctions. So there's this group called the IUCN, and they have this thing called the Red List. And the Red List is a list of how threatened various species are. They have about 100,000 species that they've been tracking over time and measuring how threatened they are. Some of them are not threatened at all, and some of them are extinct. And one way that people look at biodiversity health is just this question of how are species moving through this chain of not threatened to threatened to extinct, and what does that say about biodiversity? So here they summarize on their page of the ones that they've studied, more than 26,000 of them are now threatened, which is 27% of all the assessed species. So that is another index. Is that right? Okay. So now let's talk about how to collect biodiversity data. This is fun. There are lots of ways to collect the data that go into these kinds of studies. One way, the kind of classic way, are biological inventories. This is like you go out in the field and you count the species. And maybe you do an all taxobiological inventory where you get a fleet of taxonomic experts of all classes, and you get them out in the field and just identify everything you possibly can. There are forest inventories that are national, and they focus on trees, and some of those have been going on for hundreds of years. This is like field work. You go out there and you count the stuff, and there are a lot of really great data sets that are these inventories. They can be fun, they can be challenging, but they definitely get you out among the species. There are citizen science efforts. So there's one I have up here is called iNaturalist. iNaturalist is you get it on your cell phone and you go around and you take pictures of stuff and you share it with your friends, and it goes into iNaturalist. And they have a machine learning algorithm that can help identify things. You can send things to experts to help you classify them, and an awful lot of data are collected with iNaturalist, and there are other citizen science sources of data. And one of the big open questions is, if you're trying to do sort of research using these data, under what circumstances, what uncertainties you have to attach to data that are collected by citizens, and what are the biases that come from citizen science data. So there's kind of a rich area of interest there around where these data fit in. All right, people are using drones and the drones, this is like an exploding and very interesting area. People are attaching all kinds of sensors to drones now. The last one I saw was somebody had attached a thermal camera to a drone and was trying to use machine learning to count species at night. And for certain kinds of species, that was doing a pretty good job. So people are flying these things around, they're programming them, they're doing repeated visits of the same area to see biodiversity over time. And it's another exciting and fun area. Another way people are collecting data are with camera traps. So this is an example of a camera trap. You basically strap your camera to a tree or stick it up somewhere, and it takes pictures of anything that goes by it. People have been collecting camera trap data for, I don't know, over a decade. And lots of times what happens is you get a lot of blanks. A blank is like the camera was triggered because a leaf blew across it, and you're not so interested in the leaf. You're looking for a tiger or something like that. And so these poor camera trap people, they go around, they might have 50 cameras that they've deployed, and they have to go around and look, leaf, it's a leaf, it's another leaf, And if they're interested in some specific species, like a lot of these camera trap folks are, they're interested in, I don't know, elephants or something, or a jaguar, then they're like, not a jaguar, not a jaguar, not a jaguar, jaguar, right? So one of the things that I'm working on, I started working on it at Google, and I'm still working on it at WWF, is this thing called Wildlife Insights. And Wildlife Insights is a platform for aggregating camera trap data. So there are a bunch of organizations involved in this project. Smithsonian is involved, and the WCS, a couple other organizations, and Google is involved, building a platform for people to upload data, run machine learning on the data that are uploaded so that it can identify the species for you, and then aggregate it so that people can do large-scale analyses. This is really cool for lots of reasons. Like, first of all these camera trap data are just lying around, and they're sitting on hard drives, and they're rotting, into the bin of history. And this is a chance to collect it all and keep it going. Another thing is, like I said, a lot of these camera trap installations are meant for a specific species, like tigers, and they just ignore everything else. Like, if it's not a tiger, I don't care. The rest of that stuff is called bycatch, and you might not care about it, but somebody else might, right? So this is an opportunity to collect all the data, even stuff that the people who deploy the cameras don't care about. This has a chance of giving us a really good view of biodiversity around the planet. So I'm super excited about it. It's still in development. The hope is to get it out by the end of this year. Wildlife Insights. Yeah. Speaking of machine learning, there are efforts to identify individuals, right? So here's a project that WWF did with Intel to use AI to identify individual tigers. And there are other efforts to identify giraffes and zebras. And my favorite is whale sharks. So whale sharks you can identify from the spots that are on them. Each whale shark has an individual set of spots. And there's a group called WildMe, and they have a site. It's like a social network for whale sharks. So if you take a picture of a whale shark, you can upload it, and it'll recognize, oh, that's Bobby the whale shark. And it'll connect you to other people who have seen Bobby the whale shark. But in my mind, even cooler, whale sharks sometimes hang out together, and so they're making a social network of the whale sharks. Like, oh, Bobby hangs out with Jane whale shark. And so they're actually seeing like which whale sharks hang out together. And they're doing all kinds of stuff like the best traveled whale shark, and the most gregarious whale shark. Tons of fun. Right, and if you like machine learning and artificial intelligence, plenty of things to do here. So another thing people are using is DNA. There's a little debate about what you get to call eDNA and what is just DNA. I'm going to call everything eDNA because I don't care. The idea is you're collecting DNA to identify species. In some cases, like this one, this is a WWF project where they're scooping up what's happening in these paw prints and identifying what's going on there. And so in this case, they found that these paw prints were made by a polar bear that was eating a seal and being, I guess, apparently, spied on by this bird. So they were able to find the DNA of all those critters. Typically, people do things like they go to watering holes where a lot of species are visiting, and the question is, what species go to this watering hole? And you just take a scoop of the water and you sequence whatever's in there, and you identify the species from that. Yeah, ocean surveys and soil surveys are similar. It's using DNA to figure out what the biodiversity of that area is. And then I've done some work with people who are interested in grizzlies and reintroducing grizzlies, or at least maintaining the grizzly population. And there, they use DNA to figure out individual grizzly bears. And they have these barbed wire things that the grizzly bears, have to kind of scuttle under, and it catches their hair, and then they sequence the hair. And they actually can find out, like, if there's a cub, whose cub it is, which is nice. So they're able to really get a sense for that population that's up there in British Columbia. Oh. Okay. Now, so those are a few indirect ways of measuring biodiversity. So I want to spend a little time about talking about who cares about this stuff, where it fits into the sort of the global political system of biodiversity and the planet's health. Right. So these are targets. What is this? Archer fish. This is the kind of thing that got me into this stuff. This fish is amazing, right? I mean, it just sits under the water and it shoots its food, so if its food falls down and then it eats it. What a great idea. All right. So there are a couple of international bodies that care about biodiversity. The UN has the Sustainability Development Goals. So this is how can humans live on the planet and develop to the extent that we need to get the next 2 billion people that are going to show up in a way that doesn't collapse ourselves and our environment. And there are a bunch of different goals, and 2 of those are life below water and life on land, and these are measures of biodiversity health according to these Sustainability Development Goals. And these things drive a lot of what's happening in governments. Like, governments are actively trying to meet these goals. And a lot of them are up in the goal. The review period is 2030, but there's a check-in in 2020, which is like next year, and to see how we're doing. And these ones are in this weird state. And this is another place where if you want to do research, it's a good place to do research, where the indicators for these, like, oh, well, what does life below water mean? Like, how do we measure how well that's doing? The indicators they're tiered by like how measurable they are, and the ones for these are not at the highest tier of measurability, and there's a risk that they're going to be knocked off in the 2020 review of these things, which would basically pull biodiversity out of the Sustainable Development Goals, which would be a shame. So if we have a chance to to raise those up in the tiers of measurability, we ought to do it, and we have about a year to do it. The other set of targets are these Aichi targets. These were created by the Convention on Biological Diversity. So the Convention of Biological Diversity was set up in 1992, and these targets were created in 2010, and there are another set that's due in 2020. So 2020 is a big, party year for people who look at these international conventions, because there are a lot of them are up for review in 2020. And so here you can see those targets. And they're all over the place, right? So it's not just this population stuff I've been talking about. There are other things that these targets care about. So things like, conserving the gene pool, protected areas, increasing the number of protected areas, reducing the amount of loss, sustainable fisheries, right? So each of these has indices under them that measure these things. And you can see that this is the Convention on Biological Diversity, but they care more about just these populations and these kinds of things I've been talking about so far. It's the much broader targets. There was recently a study, like, how are we doing on these things so far? It was 2010, they're due in 2020. What's the story? The story is not so great. This protected areas one, is doing pretty well. They set a target for 17% of the terrestrial area, and I think also the marine area will be protected, and we're close to hitting that. The other ones, not so good. Now there's a question for these, which is how to measure them, right? So I told you about measuring population and the indices around that, and measuring the number of species, and the measures around that. But these things have different kinds of indicators. And so there's an effort to create a set of measurable values that get to these targets called the essential biodiversity variables. And there are a bunch of them, and you can see that they're linked to these CBD targets and their indicators. So if you care about target 8, you can look at taxonomic diversity. And then you can talk about, well, how do we figure those out? If you want to look at species populations, that affects all of these targets. The thing I want to point out here is this RS, which means remote sensing, right? So some of these are measured by remote sensing, which is satellites, possibly airplanes, maybe drones. I'm going to talk about satellites because that's a lot what I did in Google. So there's this whole cool question of how can we measure diversity, biodiversity, and these targets from space? Well, the good news, maybe, is there are a lot of things in space measuring stuff, right? There are a ton of satellites up there. There are communication satellites. There are satellites that face into outer space looking for radio signals, telescopes in space, and then there are satellites that are looking down on the Earth and measuring things on the Earth. And we've been sticking these satellites up for decades. The Landsat set, which was brought to us by NASA, thank you, NASA, has been running since the early 70s, and it's been a continuous chain of satellites, which is just an incredibly rich data set that lets us see back in time in a consistent way. And now there are more and more satellites, and the number of satellites that are relevant for measuring biodiversity is increasing. The amount of data that they are generating is tremendous and terrifying, but also a source of great information that we'll be able to use. The thing that I worked on at Google was the question of, like, given that we have all this data, and it's a lot of data, how do we manage it and how do we use it? Because back when I started there, which was like 2010, the US government had just made the Landsat data free and openly available, which was amazing, but it was still like a little tricky to use. So, and people were always like doing the same thing: download the data, then you get rid of the clouds, and you make these mosaics. And there's a set of things that people were doing over and over and over again. So we decided to try to simplify that, and we built this Earth Engine thing. And the idea with Earth Engine is we started downloading as much publicly available data as we were allowed to. We talked to all the data providers and got their permission first. And now it's up to like 18 petabytes of data. So it's like the whole Landsat catalog and a bunch of other data sets, lots of other geospatial data, not just satellite data. And it's all sitting in the sort of Google clusters. And then there are computers that are used to analyze them in a programming interface that lets you write your own analyses. And the trick is, if you use the programming language, any analysis you do gets run automatically over lots and lots of machines. So you can scale up your studies very easily. You can get them working on a small area, and then if you want to run it on a larger area, you just do it. You don't have to think about it, and the system just uses more machines, which is handy. So we did a lot of good stuff with this thing. It's still going. It's free. You can go to earthengine.google.com and use it. One of the first things we did was we mined the Landsat data. We worked with a guy named Randy Sargent at Carnegie Mellon to do this. Took every year's worth of data, composited it, cleared out the clouds, and then glued it together in a global movie. So this is 30-meter imagery. So each of these pixels is 30 meter. And you can see all kinds of cool stuff in this. So here's a river meandering in Peru with this little town kind of growing wisely this direction. You can see Las Vegas growing over time and the neighboring lake shrinking over time. Actually, the water is going down here to Los Angeles. That's smart. You can see center pivot irrigation in the Saudi desert. This reminds me of Conway's Map of Life, or a Game of Life. Like, what is this? And you can see forest loss happening in the Amazon. So here, initially there are these two little roads, and then you get this kind of, they call it the fishbone pattern. It's the very traditional forest loss pattern that you see all over the place. It's roads. So it's roads, and then roads spinning off roads, and then farms coming off the roads. Yeah, it's all agriculture. So, to create this was a lot of data. It was about a petabyte of data, and we figured it took about 2 million CPU hours. So, like, if you had it under your computer, under your desk, it would take about like 250 years to run on a single machine, but it got spread over 66,000 CPUs. So instead, it took about a day and a half to build these things, and that's because we were able to leverage the power of parallelization. And this thing is being used now for science applications, and so relevant to these indicators I mentioned. One of the first studies was with Dr. Matt Hansen at University of Maryland now, where he used the system to measure tree cover loss over time. So he was able to mine, again, it was Landsat, to determine where forest was and where forest changed over time. And this is another machine learning problem, right? Like, when you look at a pixel from Landsat, is it forest or is it not forest? How do you know? It's not like it has a big F on the pixel saying, I'm forest, right? You have to do machine learning and train it up. Say, here's an example of forest, here's an example of not forest, learn. So he used machine learning to generate these images, and he's been updating it every year. And these have been going back into the system and being deployed on other websites to great effect. So here's the system called Global Forest Watch. This is a site that has a lot of partners. The main convener of it is the World Resources Institute, and they're bringing together a lot of data sets and also a lot of stakeholders who care about those data sets and are providing simple analyses that you can do on the site and also sort of telling stories around it. And one of the things they have is this woody biomass density image that they helped build with the Woods Hole Research Center, and I think Matt Hansen was involved also. So this is one of the indicators for the essential biodiversity variables, is how much biomass is there. And you can go to the site and look at this data set. You can also call up a data set that shows, takes the Hansen loss data and measures how much biomass loss there's been over time. So this is from starting at 2000, this is the loss that happened by 2003, like 2010, by the end of the sequence. And you can zoom in, because again, these are like 30 meter pixels, so you can zoom in pretty far and you can see where losses happened. The yellowish ones is higher biomass loss. As it tends to red, it's a little bit less. So this starts showing you these kind of essential biodiversity variables, how those measure biodiversity health as like kind of like surrogates for biodiversity. This is a system for doing one of those. I'm gonna soon get into the why we should care, but I just want to point out a couple of websites that are kind of interesting if you're interested in looking at biodiversity globally. One is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Okay, these folks, their main reason to exist is to encourage organizations around the world to adhere to standards for sharing data. And so they have a bunch of different standards that they're pushing and encouraging people to use. One of them is this thing called the Darwin Core, which is a very simple standard for sharing species observation data. And before GBIF was around, I think it started around 2000. Everybody was holding onto their data and nobody was sharing it. And even if they wanted to, there was no clear way to do it because there's no standard way of doing it. So through GBIF and associated organizations that were working on these standards, they set up kind of a nice standard and also way of sharing the data that lots of people have been using. And now they've been able to aggregate up to like now more than 1 trillion records from people, from 1,000 institutions that are sharing the data. So you can go to GBIF and you can type in a location, you can look at specific kind of taxa, and see what records are in GBIF. Now, most of them are birds, right? Because birders love collecting data and they love sharing it, and they're very friendly people. And so I'm not sure what percentage of these trillion records are birds, but it's a significant amount. So if you're a bird person, you're like in heaven here. But it's not just birds. There are lots of other data sets in here. What else? OK. So the thing that's nice about GBIF are these standards. So now people are working on standards to share data, and this is happening increasingly, and it's very comforting that now people are coming together to work together on these projects, whereas before they were very siloed. Another cool project is the Map of Life. They do a number of things. One of the things they do is they have all these species habitat models for lots of different species, and they refine them given additional information. So this kind of blob might have been drawn by some expert, like, oh, what is this? Some kind of bird. Right? Oh, what's the range of this bird? Well, it's this. Or it could be generated by some kind of modeling system like Maxent or GARP, which are systems to create these things based on observations. And then the Map of Life uses further information to kind of refine it, to take other characteristics like the land cover that this creature likes and elevation it likes, and kind of makes a more refined map. And then they pull in the GBIF observations to see if those GBIF observations are still within the refined map. And then they keep track of that, and they keep track of how much of the land in here is protected. And then they generate that species habitat index that I had mentioned, which is how the habitats change over time. So you can go to the Map of Life, and they have all other kinds of stuff going on. It's a pretty good system. All right. So why do we care? All right. So I talked about what biodiversity is, different ways of measuring it, and the international bodies that are monitoring it. But why does any of this matter? This, by the way, is that intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. I forgot what the P was. Yeah, they all care. Other people care. So the World Economic Forum, which is this organization that puts on the Davos conference. If you've heard about Davos, that's their big fiesta of CEOs and like individuals. It's 1,000 different large companies, and the people in those companies really care about the state of the world economy, because this is how they run their companies. And every year they do a survey of all these people, and they say, what keeps you up at night? And they plot everything on the scale of how likely is that thing to happen, and how bad is it going to be if it happens. It's a little bit hard to read, but the quadrant that is the stressful one is the upper right one. That's the likely bad thing. And then number one is extreme weather events. All right, so this is interesting. Like these people, the 1,000 biggest companies, they're taking climate change seriously, right? This is like top of mind for them. Then there's like natural disasters and cyber attacks are pretty bad, but biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse are pretty far up there too. And you can actually map the change over time of these things, and that one, the biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, is like inching up in the stress corner. So they care about it, and there's actually a whole set of indices that they're coming up with independently of these international bodies that are business-focused indices called the science-based targets for nature, and they're going nuts developing these standards and committing to them. So this is a kind of a private sector version of these international conferences that I told you about. So they care about it. So I'm going to give you 3 reasons why everybody should care about it. There's an aesthetic reason, an ethical reason, and a practical reason. Okay. So the aesthetic reason is like what got me into this to begin with, right? We live in a very thin ring of biodiversity around the planet. There are amazing creatures and plants that have evolved over hundreds of millions of years, and they're interacting in amazing ways. They do incredible things. They're highly adapted to their environment. They're extremely weird. They're very beautiful. And our lives are just richer for having them around us, right? Here are some diatoms. So this is the aesthetic argument. Like all this biodiversity around us is amazing. It's complex. It's beautiful. We're not going to come up with that. I mean, we come up with some pretty cool stuff. You know, Bach is all right, and lots of novels are great, and I love a lot of art. You know, and these buildings are cool, but it's not hundreds of millions of years of evolution creating these highly diverse and unusual plants, animals, fungus, and metagenomic, whatever they happen to be. So that's the aesthetic argument. Now, maybe you don't buy the aesthetic argument, like, okay, that's really nice, but you're so sentimental, like, get over it, who cares? All right, then you go to the ethical argument. The ethical argument goes like this. Ethics. So there are about 10, this is an estimate. Nobody knows how many species there are, right? We've identified around 1.8 million species. We're discovering new ones all the time. There's a little bit of fudge factor around, is there any double counting in there? But that's the order of magnitude that we know about, 1.8. And there's this question of, well, how many actually are there? Let's not talk about the metagenomic stuff for now. Just, plants, animals, fungi. How many are there? And their estimates, they range from like, we found them all, lucky us, to there are 100 million. I'm going to choose 10 million. 10 million is the number I hear the most often. But there's some fudge factor there. Now, imagine that we live in a city, maybe like Los Angeles, that has about 10 million citizens, right? So instead of 10 million species, we have 10 million citizens. Now, like us, species have lifespans. Mammals have a lifespan of about 1 million years. And they also have extinction rates or mortality rates. So the baseline extinction rate is about 1 species per year globally, currently, with 10 million species. And I looked this up, and in LA, the mortality rate now is about 6 people per hour. Sorry. Hopefully it's none of us. So that's the baseline. But now, extinction rates have been increasing. And these are also numbers that are a little bit fuzzy, but the estimated current rate of extinction is about 1,000 to 10,000 species per year. Right? And some people say, oh, no, that's totally exaggerated. Other people have it more like 100,000 per year. I chose kind of the middle one. If you do the comparable thing over there, the equivalent mortality rate is 6,000 to 60,000 people per hour, right? So somewhere there's one of those citizens, one of those 10 million citizens who's jumping the mortality rate from 6 per hour to 6,000 per hour, right? And you got to wonder about that citizen, right? That citizen needs a lot of help, needs some serious psychotherapy at least, a good talking to. I wouldn't want to meet that citizen, and I certainly wouldn't want to be that citizen, but we are that citizen, right? This incredible increased extinction rate is due to us, and we should really knock it off. It's not right. That's the ethical argument. Now, you could say, well, humans, I've got an ethical system which is internally consistent and is based on various priors, and one is that humans are special and these other species are here to basically serve us, and so deal with it, right? And that's, a system of belief. So maybe you don't believe the ethical argument. I believe the ethical argument, and I also believe the aesthetic argument, but not everybody does. So that gets to the practical arguments, which are things like, we need biodiversity as a species to survive. And as we are decreasing biodiversity on our planet, we are hurting ourselves directly in lots of ways. So one way is medicine. 56% of the 150 most popular medicines have come from plants that were discovered in the wild. There is, I forget what the number is, I got it here. The National Cancer Institute says 70% of promising anti-cancer drugs come from plants in tropical rainforests, many of which we haven't discovered yet. So we want to keep coming up with good medicines, we need to preserve biodiversity. Practical thing number 1. 2, food. We need to eat. There's a lot of diversity in the foods that we eat. Monocultures are not particularly safe, so it'll be good to have fallbacks. But also, biodiversity helps create the food that we eat. So 2/3 of crops that we eat are pollinated by insects. So we have to keep an eye on the biodiversity of those insects, otherwise we're going to have a huge collapse in our food system. Also, there are examples of people finding wild varieties of foods, like the wild rice, that have then been crossbred with traditional rice to have higher yields. So as we remove the species from the planet, we're removing the chance of finding these things that can improve the yield. Well-being. So there are tons of studies talking about how we're just happier in nature. When you do memory tests of people who've taken a walk through the park versus down the road, you do better after you've walked through the park. My favorite is this brain scan study. So apparently there's a part of your brain that lights up when you're thinking bad thoughts about yourself. And that part of your brain, the activation is decreased if you've taken a walk through nature, and so it's a signal of decreased depression. So our well-being is based on being surrounded by nature. Nature provides lots of services that we care about, like clean water. Wetlands filter the water. So New York City found it could save up to $8 billion in creating new plants just by having the proper land in place to help filter the water. Lots of other ecosystem services like that nature's providing, and it's biodiversity that's doing that. Another example is protection from floods. So Katrina, for instance, that hurricane was extra bad because New Orleans had pulled the mangroves away from, these are mangroves, by the way. New Orleans had gotten rid of the mangroves. The World Bank had recently released a study saying that mangroves reduce water velocity from 29 to 92% when they're in place. So this is driving a lot of mangrove replanting efforts. All right, so those are the reasons, right? So I think the practical one, even if you don't buy the aesthetic one or the ethical one, the practical one, for very self-centered reasons, I think is a good one to protect biodiversity. So how do we do it? The good news is we still have time to make big changes in how we're living as a species to better protect biodiversity. This is just the IUCN Red List chart again. They list, 945 species extinct since we started studying them, just show you what the current situation is. There are lots of impacts that we can do something about. So one of the biggest drivers of species loss is agriculture. 50% of habitable land is agriculture, and that's growing. And we're going to have more people coming over the next 30 years, and we're going to need to feed them. A lot of the agriculture is converted not to feed us directly, but to feed livestock that then feeds us, which is pretty inefficient. So some things that we can do in agriculture are increase yields is one thing. We can reduce waste, so 1/4 of the food that's made now is just wasted. So we could reduce the amount of new agriculture by just wasting less food. And another thing is we could just eat less meat. That would help. You don't have to be vegetarian, but even cutting back a little bit helps. Oh, this is showing how much of the land by country is devoted to agriculture. Another source of biodiversity loss is overconsumption. This is Global Fishing Watch. This is a cool site. They are tracking all of the fishing vessels above a certain size on every 5 minutes or something like that. Their fishing vessels above a certain size are required to emit a signal saying where they are, and Global Fishing Watch tracks all of those, and it looks at individual boats and sees what they're doing and uses machine learning to detect whether they're fishing or not, and then checks to see if they're fishing in protected areas, and if they are, warns the appropriate authorities, who then do the right thing to stop them from happening. So there are efforts now around curbing overexploitation, which are great. Infrastructure development is another big one. The statistic is 75% of the infrastructure built now, or 75% of the infrastructure that will be in place in 2050 has not yet been built. So there were plans now for something like 25 million kilometers of roads, which is like one road 600 times around the Earth. There's not good story about how to plan infrastructure in a green, sustainable way. So there's a lot of work that could be done there. And the final thing that we can do to change is to help put a curb on climate change, right? All of the other stuff I talked about is having direct current impact on species loss. This, people talk about the 6th mass extinction, which people say is happening now. It's like the sister crisis to climate change. And climate change is involved. And the way it's involved is, as the climate changes, habitats move, right? So if you're, this is called a climate velocity map. So if you're here under some climate regime, whatever climate is here is going to move here. And the question is, well, if the climate moves there, what are the species that are acclimated to that climate going to do? Some are going to be able to move, and they'll move. Others won't be able to move, and they're going to be out of luck. And there are some climates that are just going to be gone, and the creatures and plants that live in those climates are definitely out of luck. So whatever we can do to limit climate change, we need to do for biodiversity and also just for the climate. Like I said, there are many different versions of how we can achieve the goal of growing our population by the predicted 2 billion people in the next 30 years in a sustainable way that will let us continue to live in harmony or more in harmony with nature. So this is an example of a paper that talks about it. There are others. So this is the hopeful story. And I'm going to just end with this statement, which is the close of the Living Planet report. We are the first generation that has a clear picture of the value of nature and the enormous impact we have on it. We may also be the last that can act to reverse this trend. So I encourage you all to join the fight in preserving biodiversity. Thanks very much. And thank all the people whose images I took.